And welcome to the Broomfield Veterans Museum for our 214th Coffee and Conversation. And we certainly have a good crowd today, so that's marvelous. Before we get going, I'd like to just remind everyone, good time to turn off your cell phones or put them on mute. Invariably, they're going to go off partway through the talk. And looks like we're getting some more people settled.
Mike's not working.
It isn't? Hey, Jim? This doesn't seem to work. Testing, testing, testing. Okay, much better. Good, great. Well, anyway, to get going again, I would like to highlight a very special guest with us today. In fact, Wayne Luth. Could you raise your hand, Wayne? Wayne is a World War II veteran. And is going to be our coffee and conversation speaker on the 13th of November. I think, do we have another one? Did I see someone pointing in what direction? Okay. Well, in any event, come visit our coffee and conversation on the 13th of November, and you'll hear Wayne's story. Not only that, it's a double benefit. We're going to be celebrating the Marine Corps' birthday. And I don't know which year that is, but anyway, our MOA chapter is going to be here. We'll have a cake, and we'll have that celebration immediately after Wayne's talk. So please join us, mark your calendar for that. On the 11th of November, Veterans Day, we'll be having our Veterans Day program. In the past, we've been able to do it at the high school. Unfortunately, that's still closed off to us. So we've put in a request for great weather on the 11th, and we're going to have it outdoors. We'll have all sorts of stuff. I mean, we've got patriotic music, we've got our American Living History reenactors who will be here, our American Legion Post will present arms. We'll have a guest speaker, we'll have exhibits, and we'll have lots of refreshments. So please join us on the 11th. It'll start at 11 a.m. Come a little early. If the weather isn't so good, we'll have Plan B, which will be a smaller version probably in here, at least with the guest speaker and exhibits and reception in the museum. Just to remind everyone, we do survive on donations. We've been very fortunate today, if you've seen all the donuts we have, courtesy of us and MOA. But if you'd ever like to make a little donation to help us going, we have donation boxes right back here and elsewhere in the museum. So anyway, this is a marvelous talk. I have an interest in what happened in Guadalcanal because my father commanded one of the destroyers that was involved in the various naval actions in Guadalcanal, and eventually was sunk in the Battle of Colomangora, which occurred as we were moving up through New Georgia. So anyway, without further ado, and Don has been a previous speaker several times with us, and is an author. What is one of your books?
No Silent Night.
The Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
Excellent. And we'll get Don back next year to talk about that as well.
Absolutely.
So without further ado, Don?
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Mike also reminded me that it's been many years since I've spoken here. I think there was a little bit of guilt in that inflection when he was telling me that. But I'm glad to be back here, and good morning to everyone. Particularly, of course, our World War II veteran, and any other World War II veterans out there, and our Marine Corps. Any of our Marine Corps veterans here will be you guys will have an extreme interest in this talk today. The focus is going to be on the land battle of Guadalcanal, and particularly what the Marines did there. We know the Army came in a little later, more Marine reinforcements. And we also know that Guadalcanal was a very large struggle. So there were, in fact, naval units, there was combat at sea, as Mike had mentioned, air units, there was air combat going on over Henderson Field. It is what is called by military historians an all-domain battle, which are the big ones. We think about D-Day, we think about Okinawa, the very large struggles where you had every aspect of combat arms involved. And some of you know Guadalcanal lasted for almost 6 months, the struggle there. So to cover such a huge topic like that, as I was kind of jokingly telling this young lady, that this is kind of like Guadalcanal Part 1 is the way I'd like you to think about it. And maybe in the future I can put something together to cover a little bit more. And because of that, I'm going to kind of move very quickly through the background information to get to where we want to focus, which is the Battle of the Tenarú and why that was so key. Not just key to Guadalcanal, but key to the entire war for the Pacific. See if this is... Where do I aim this, Mike?
Mike? You want to advance?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the little red dot.
Oh, my bad. I thought it was the arrows.
No. Well, point toward the screen.
Okay.
You'll be able to tell. The little red thing.
Yeah. We're not getting an advance on this, though.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
Technical difficulties, bear with us.
Well, you're right. How about that?
Wonder if it's a battery issue?
Could be. So just keep talking.
Okay, all right.
Both of you need basic training over.
Yeah, there you go. They say, adapt and overcome, right? We'll get going here in just a second, folks. Sorry about that. Real quickly, though, just a quick little story to start this out with. This summer, my wife and I traveled to French Polynesia, South Pacific. Wonderful little trip down there. And some of you, if you know your Pacific geography, you know that French Polynesia is way over here in the southeastern portion of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, we're talking about a chain of islands which is almost there, cresting South America in that area. So while we were there, I had always heard that there were these gun installations on the island of Bora Bora. And when we were on Bora Bora, I decided to ask one of the local guides there, one of the Polynesian guides, if he would take us for a little trip and if we could find a couple of those gun emplacements. There were at least, I think there were 10 of these 7-inch guns that had been installed by the United States coastal artillery battalions. And they had put these things in place in 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor, to protect Bora Bora. The guns, there's only about 3 or so of them that are accessible. And so I thought to myself, this guide is definitely going to know where they are up in the highlands and the mountains and in the jungle. And he was a great guide. His name was James. And he took us for a little ride in a Land Rover, and we went up there. And of course, my wife had no interest in this whatsoever. And I'm taking photos left and right of this old rusty gun. These guns were built in 1905, and they were World War I era guns. And they were not on board a ship, as probably many of you know, especially some of you Navy veterans. A lot of those were stripped out of old World War I battleships, and they were used for coastal batteries. These guns had always been coastal batteries, but they were transported to Bora Bora, and they were emplaced all around strategic parts of the island to cover the island. And in 1942, is there a way we can go to the next slide, maybe manually, Mike? Yeah. In 1942, these guns were basically the defense of the island in case the Japanese attacked. And we're going to show you a picture of those here in just a second.
Sorry, the whole thing.
Whole thing's frozen up. That's... Oh, there we go. You had it. You had it.
You want to go back?
Yeah, one more back. There we go. Okay, and you can see these. This was our guide here, James. He was a lovely gentleman, Polynesian in his 60s. And when we were walking around there, I said, okay, well, these guns been up here. There were obviously crews to these guns. There were also CBs, Navy CBs. There were Army units there to man these guns. And how many troops were here stationed in Bora Bora? And he said around 7,000 Americans were in Bora Bora.
I think that'll do.
You think we got it? Good.
Yeah.
So those 7,000 U.S. servicemen, I asked him this question rather pointedly, and I said, you know, everything I've ever seen, I'm sure some of you have seen the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical South Pacific, right? And I said, I always got this impression that one of the biggest issues for the local people was keeping their women away from the American GIs, right? All these beautiful young Polynesian women. And I said, you know, according to the musical and from other stories I'd heard about other places like Fiji and areas like this, when they build an American base, a lot of the local chiefs would get together and they would move their women to another island, keep them away from the GIs, right? And I said, how did you resolve that issue here in Bora Bora? And he goes, sir, he says, did you notice that my eyes are green? So there was, yeah, okay, anyway. But the reason I bring all of this up is because you would think that that far east in the Pacific was no concern for the United States. We felt that would be far enough away from any sort of Japanese incursion, but evidently not. We had to guard this base, and we had 7,000 soldiers there to do it. And I'm going to explain why that was here, and why Guadalcanal actually plays a part in that. I am hoping I just didn't turn it off. It is showing a low battery. I'm sorry, folks. It just went out.
John, well, we have a minute.
Sure, go ahead.
Tell us the name of your book about
The Battle of the Bulge. No Silent Night, The Christmas Battle for Bastogne. And it is available. You can get it on, you know, any bookstore. You can get it on Amazon.
We might even have a copy in our library.
I think we do. Let's try this.
You can see it. We'll look for it.
Oh, thank you.
I'm still not having any luck here. It might be, is there a chance maybe I could have a person just hit? Okay, and I'll just tell you when to switch the slide. Okay, so main points I want to cover here. As I said before, this was a colossal struggle for Guadalcanal. So I'm only going to hit on a couple of points here today. Maybe in the future we can take a wider view of it. And I'm going to move rather quickly here through the background of why it was strategically important in the overall strategic situation in the South Pacific. But as I mentioned before, this was the very first United States encounter, many people don't realize that, major battle that was fought during World War II. Before, there was a invasion of North Africa in the European theater, or what we would call the Mediterranean theater proper. Guadalcanal was going on several months before that. And one of these situations there is that we learned a lot of lessons from this very first conflict. Believe it or not, some of the lessons that we learned at Guadalcanal would actually carry over to the European theater and were put to use for the invasion of North Africa, the invasion of Italy, and the invasion of Normandy as well. The strategic importance of the Solomon Islands to the United States, we'll touch on that. The strategic importance to the Japanese. And why this Battle of the Tinaroo, which confusingly has three names: Tinaroo River, Elu River, and Alligator Creek. And it gets rather confusing. I'm going to refer to it pretty much continuously as the Tinaroo River because that's what it's gone down as. It was mismarked on the maps that the Marine Corps had, and so therefore they believed their position was on the Tinaroo when actually it was the next river over and it was the Elu River. And the Marines... Yeah, and then the Marines themselves had given it the name of Alligator Creek, at least where the lagoon was. And I'll show you some more about where that was located as well. It was basically in this area right here of Guadalcanal. You can see the river right there coming out of the highlands. And so it's kind of like one of those things. Those of you who know anything about the Revolutionary War and the Battle of Bunker Hill, right? Bunker Hill was not fought on Bunker Hill. It was fought on Breed's Hill. but it became known as Bunker Hill because there was a mix-up with the map and all this. So it may get a little confusing here, but I will just pretty much continuously refer to it as the Battle of the Tinaroo. But just to let you know that you will hear it sometimes as Alligator Creek or Elu. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, let's talk Japanese strategy. Why were the Solomon Islands and why was Guadalcanal so important to the Japanese strategy for a conquest in the Pacific? Couple of reasons. The first one, when you do take a look at a map here, is you will take a look at the Japanese conquest here in the red in the Pacific, and you will realize that as they swing down here and as they capture the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, the Philippines, Indochina, that they have cut off Australia and New Zealand from the rest of the Pacific Ocean. And that was very important, of course. Australia and New Zealand were our two biggest allies in the Pacific during the war. So to be separated from Australia and New Zealand, the rest of the United States here would have been really bad. And the Japanese realized that. The other aspect, some of you know this, Japan depended on many natural resources from this part of the world. Yes, rubber, oil, petroleum, tin, lots of different things that they needed, and they needed to keep those supply lines for their ships up to Japan. And then we have, of course, this power extension. During the Pacific War, Japanese strategy is looking at 3 routes of travel in order to, I guess we wouldn't say invade the United States, because there's a big question about whether that was realistic, but to contain the United States as a threat to their expansion. The first one was north, and some of you know this story. The Japanese actually went up into the Aleutian Islands, and they were able to take a line of advance up there. Now, it was, of course, a huge failure, but that was one of their strategies. The other one was across the Central Pacific, and that, of course, ended up in the Battle of Midway. Some of you know about that in June of 1942. And the other one was the southern extension, which was to come down here, and we sometimes forget that the Japanese at the beginning of the war had their own version of island hopping, their own strategy that they had prepared to move through these islands and close in on the Americas. Threaten South America, particularly threaten the Panama Canal. Because think of how important the Panama Canal was to the United States and their strategy in running both of these wars, right? In Europe and in the Pacific. So you can understand why this was crucial to the Japanese and why the Solomon Islands, located right here, were going to be strategically important. Tried it again, but it didn't work. Maybe we get another one. Thanks, John. So there's just kind of an idea here along this spread of islands, and you'll see where I draw this back to this experience I had in Bora Bora. So believe it or not, yes, the United States was very concerned about this advance. The Japanese coming here through the Solomons, Fiji, which was an American base, Samoa, as we know, which is an American protectorate, and then all the way into Tahiti, the French Polynesian Islands here. This is about where Bora Bora is, and on. So you can see what the situation was there, what the threat was, and how the Japanese and the United States regarded that. Next slide, please. Okay, and yeah, the key to Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, and Guadalcanal is going to be basically the key to the Solomons. The Solomon Archipelago is a lot of different islands there. Some of you are familiar with some of those. Why was Guadalcanal so important? Well, Guadalcanal, as you can see, was one of the biggest islands. And it also had some of the flattest level ground before this mountain range, which was the spine of the island, that an airfield could be constructed on, which was vital. Next slide. So now the U.S. Pacific strategy. So what were we thinking in 1942? After Pearl Harbor, after the war has erupted, we really weren't even looking at the Solomon Islands. We had our own concerns. As we know, that thrust up into the Aleutians and that Japanese thrust towards Hawaii via Wake and Midway was much more of a concern, a going concern, in early 1942. That, and of course, we had just gotten kicked out of the Philippines, and we had some issues there with, the island of Wake being taken over, Guam, these areas. So there wasn't a whole lot of focus on the Solomon Islands. And then remember that there was the Arcadia Conference, where FDR, and Churchill, Stalin, they sit down and they start coming up with this Europe First strategy. And that was the original plan, which gets thrown out the window very quickly. And the United States realizes they are going to have to focus on what's going on in the Pacific first. Spring and summer of 1942, though, the American intelligence services start to get these reports that the Japanese are moving from Rabaul into the Solomon Islands. And they're starting a presence there, so they're starting that advance. And during this time, remember, most of what the United States military is geared towards is this upcoming invasion, Operation Torch, of North Africa. All of the Army units are earmarked for that. So who does that leave as far as the most available fighting unit that can be put to use immediately into the Solomons? The United States Marine Corps. Okay, the Marines are available. They actually have a few of them out there in places like American Samoa, in New Zealand. They're spread kind of all over the place, but they are a presence there. And the idea is we're going to bulk up the Marines and we're going to start utilizing them in the Pacific, since so many of our Army divisions are earmarked for North Africa and Europe. Coast Watchers, some of you have heard about them. Australians, Brits, New Zealanders, and even some of the local Polynesian and Melanesian people in the Pacific. These people were keeping an eye on the Japanese, spying on them at tremendous risk to their lives. But they were reporting back to the Allies what was going on. And their information was very, very accurate. That was one of the amazing things, even from many of these very, I hesitate to use primitive, but these Melanesian and Polynesian people who were understanding what was going on here, what the threat was to their own way of life, too, from the Japanese Empire. So the focus, of course, in May and June, Coral Sea, right, Midway, those naval battles to stymie the Japanese from their naval advance through the Central Pacific. And then we have these primary concerns about the West Coast. Remember, there was a fear that the Japanese might attack California, Panama, and that is basically where the strategic emphasis is. Now, what do you want to look at for the American strategy? You just kind of got to flip the Japanese strategy on its head. What we need to do is we need to stop the Japanese from this advance, and then we need to start backing up through. I'm sure some of you have heard about MacArthur and Nimitz and the whole plan of island hopping in order to get back to Tokyo and end the war there. So you can see where Guadalcanal, stuck in the middle of this, becomes almost like a tug of war. It's going to be like a seesaw, like a tug of war going on at the tip of this whole conflict. And whatever happens there in Guadalcanal is going to determine which side that seesaw falls on. Okay? And who's going to have the advantage in the Pacific. Now, the United States Navy, when they talked with Admiral King, they talked with Admiral Nimitz, the big fear here is if we send carrier task force down to the Guadalcanal, to the Solomons, that they're going to be in enclosed waters. The Japanese have a base, Rabaul, New Georgia, which is really nearby, in which they can send lots of their aircraft. It's like a land aircraft carrier. And a lot of people don't realize, it was kind of kept as a little bit of a secret in the early days of the war, that the Japanese had an incredible advantage, naval superiority, particularly in aircraft carriers. 10 fleet aircraft carriers. The United States at this time, even after Midway, where many of you know, how many aircraft carriers did the Japanese lose at Midway? 4 fleet aircraft carriers, and still they had a substantial force of aircraft carriers, even after the loss of those 4 huge aircraft carriers. A lot of people don't realize that. Midway certainly was an important turning point in the war, but Guadalcanal would become even more important. Okay? There's no denying that. The United States, after Midway, had basically 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and at one point 2. The Hornet and the Enterprise. The Saratoga, bad run of luck. Some of you know the story about the Saratoga. She constantly had engine problems and she was hit by torpedoes from Japanese subs several times. Had to spend most of her Pacific career in dry dock. So she was kind of knocked out of the running. Of course, we weren't about to let the public know about that. We weren't about to let the Japanese know about that. But at one point we did. We only had 2 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. There was also the USS Wasp, which was an aircraft carrier in the Atlantic. And very quickly, King decides that we're going to move that through the Panama Canal and get over the Pacific, over to the Guadalcanal as quick as possible. And there was an older aircraft carrier, very slow, the USS Ranger. And the Ranger was just felt to be not an adequate aircraft carrier for the Pacific, so it was kept in the Atlantic as part of our force there. We're going to need those aircraft carriers to protect any sort of land invasion, right? Any sort of beach landing. You need those. Thanks. The plan that comes together for invading Guadalcanal with the Marines is called Operation Watchtower. The major general in charge of this, the Marine General, Alexander Vandegrift, and the 1st Marine Division is the one that's put with that task of taking Guadalcanal and the Solomons. Now, his division, as I mentioned before, spread out all through the Pacific. They're all over the place. They're in Samoa, there's parts of them in the United States, there's parts in Australia. And they also are not up to a full division. So very quickly in early 1942, many of these young men who have volunteered are sent through basic training in the Marine Corps, boot camp, I guess Marines call it, right? These younger Green Marines were called tyros. As some of you know, that comes from the old Roman legion days for a young recruit. There were very few of the old hands, the old Marines around, who were called the China Marines. And interestingly enough, it didn't matter where they served. If they had served in Nicaragua or if they had served in the Philippines or whatever, they were all known as China Marines. But these are the tough old NCOs and everything who, as you can imagine, some of these tyros were probably quaking with fear when they first ran into some of these guys. But they were able to put together a sizable force, and by coordination, they managed to get these forces loaded up on these transports. And even though Vandegrift himself was telling Nimitz, and he was telling King, and he was telling several of the other leading members of the Joint Chiefs that this is really, we're being pushed on this type of thing. He was able to get the day of the invasion pushed back by a few days, but he felt very uncomfortable about throwing together this Marine force and dumping them in Guadalcanal. U.S. amphibious operations. Well, the last one we had was in 1914 in Veracruz. And if some of you know the story, during World War I, Allied amphibious operations, you had Gallipoli, which was a disaster for the British. Everything had gone so wrong, some of you know that it had cost Winston Churchill basically his career at that point in the British Admiralty. So you have this situation where people are very nervous, understandably so, about an amphibious operation, especially one that's kind of thrown together so quickly like this, and the first one of the war, the first major.
And one of the things they learned was how to actually load out the ships so you get the supplies you need first.
Yes, yes. And part of the reason they did that is particularly in New Zealand. The New Zealand dock workers went on strike. And a real uncomfortable situation developed there between the Marines and the dock workers. And it was also horrible weather, supposedly just very cold in New Zealand and rainy. And a lot of the supplies around the docks getting soaked and wet. And the Marines were called in and told, sorry, you guys are going to have to be stevedores. You guys are going to have to load up all of this equipment and everything. But that did help because the Marines are kind of like, okay, we know what we're going to need first to come out of this transport ship, Beans and bullets, be a little further back. Our weapons need to be up front. Our men need to be up front, and et cetera, et cetera. So exactly. But eventually the division, supported by other naval forces, CBs, units like that, about 16,000 strong, landed on Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi on August 7th, 1942. Some of you in the Marine Corps, I'm sure you recognize the 1st Marine Division, their very vaunted patch there with the Southern Cross on it. They did not get this, of course, until after Guadalcanal. So remember, the Marines were considered a very small, tiny, kind of thrown to the side branch of the military at this time. And they were given mostly hand-me-downs as far as weaponry and equipment. The stuff that kind of like the rest of the services, especially the Army, didn't want. You know, in particular, I'm sure some of you have seen this. The main weapon, the rifle that was used during World War II for our GIs was what? The M1 Garand, okay? This is the World War I weapon, which was the 1903 Springfield. It is not a automatic or a semi-automatic feed. It is an old classic World War I bolt action. Each time you fire. Yeah. And they even kept the old massive World War I bayonet. Remember how important the World War I the bayonet was? So these things were antiquated, definitely. And we're going to talk about a couple of these other kind of hand-me-down weapons that were given to the Marine Corps for Guadalcanal. And even though they were older, some of them actually came in handy and worked a lot better than you would have thought. Next slide. Okay, so yeah. Interestingly enough, and we're going to focus primarily on Guadalcanal here, not Tulagi, but when these forces landed at Red Beach on the northern coast, right up in this area here, at Guadalcanal, there was no Japanese resistance. And if any of you have seen some of the movies that show this, the Thin Red Line, the HBO Pacific series, it's very true that these Marines came storming ashore, you know, their guns out, bayonets on them, everything like that. Nothing. They found some of the Seabees sitting there, you know, cracking open coconuts. It's like, what took you guys so long? You know? But yeah, they basically come ashore, no resistance put up whatsoever on the beach. Now, that didn't mean that the Japanese had left. The Japanese were there. Very small contingent of Japanese. SNLF, what they called their naval landing forces, kind of their equivalent of Marines. There was a small group of maybe about 600 of them. And there was a small group of their Seabees, their Japanese engineers, who were trying to build this airfield on Guadalcanal. But they hadn't encountered them yet because the Japanese said, you know, we're outnumbered, so they just retreated to the highlands. Now, as they start to move inland towards the airfield, they do encounter the Japanese. Japanese start sniping at them, doing little hit-and-run attacks, this kind of thing on the Marines. Next slide. And by the way, this is, remember, where the road to Tokyo begins, Red Beach. It was unopposed. But do you think the Japanese were going to make that mistake in the future? No. After the landing, well, we had a couple of interesting things take place here. You have all these transport ships lining up on Red Beach, and they're dumping off equipment and men and stores. And you have to have that presence nearby outside of the Solomons of a carrier task force, the Enterprise, the Hornet, that are there to protect these troops. Because the Japanese now know what's going on. You know, the Japanese on the island have sent radio messages to Rabaul, to Truk, and to Tokyo even, saying, send reinforcements. You know, we didn't expect this, but the Americans are here. And while this is going on, you have a naval battle takes place at night, in which some of you know this story. Several American allied, actually an Australian cruiser too, were sunk by the Japanese. The Japanese were excellent naval night fighters. They were actually very good Army night fighters too. Their ships had special optics on board. The average Japanese cruiser or destroyer was 5 knots faster than an American destroyer or cruiser at the time. And they would slip into Sea Lark Channel, which was that channel down the slot in between the Solomons there. And at night, they would hit and run the American forces, the transport ships and what have you, and then it would retreat before morning. The Japanese were excellent at this. They were so good that there was this huge cruiser battle that took place, and as I mentioned, turned into a horrible defeat for the Navy. Several of their cruisers were sunk. Now, what does this do to the Naval High Command when they see a whole bunch of their cruisers have been sunk? Exactly. So we're sorry, but Admiral Fletcher said, I cannot risk my units out here. If we lose one of these valuable aircraft carriers, we're going to be in dire straits. We don't have any new aircraft carriers on the building blocks until late 1943. We cannot chance to lose the Enterprise or the Hornet or the Wasp. And actually, some of you know they did lose the Hornet and the Wasp. So, but what they had to do is they had to get out of there as quickly as possible, and this task force that was protecting the transports had to move far off, about 100 miles off to the east of the Solomon Islands. Okay, now that left the transports there without much protection. The transports did have, some anti-aircraft guns on them, that kind of stuff, but yeah, not much. The Marines, as you can imagine, were pretty angry about this. They felt they had been left high and dry, especially when the next day, the Richmond Turner, the admiral in charge of the transports, pretty gutsy guy. He kept his ships around for as long as he could, even without cover. He had to say, I can't be here anymore either. You gotta get out of here, especially when some of his transports, like the George F. Elliott, were sunk. It was sunk by a kamikaze, actually.
And it was still full of all the munitions that the Marines needed.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of these ships were, So the Japanese are really taking control of this area. And some of you know the story, Sea Lark Channel, that area outside of Guadalcanal. So many sunken vessels, it becomes known as Iron Bottom Sound. Still is today, Iron Bottom Sound, yeah. They called this, when the Japanese would come cruising in real quickly and attack, the Tokyo Express. That's what the Marines called it. Next slide, please. And there's just some pictures there showing you where this went. This red arrow here being right through Iron Bottom Sound where the Japanese were. Next slide. Yeah, raggedy-ass Marines. Well, Marines, kind of like Army guys, after a while, bitching, complaining, all this kind of stuff going on about their situation, lack of food, lack of supplies. But their morale dipped, but it never disintegrated. And that was a testimony to their training and to these old China hands, these old China Marines, their NCOs who kept them together and kept them focused on the mission. Even when their clothing was coming apart in these tropical conditions, their boots were falling apart. They had no resupply of clothing. They had very little food. They were living off of Japanese rice that they had found on the island, and sake and beer too. But most of what they had to throw together. They had to be very ingenious. And that is one of the things that establishes their reputation in the Pacific and in the military too. Here is where the Marines were really put to the test, and they come through. Not without difficulty. It certainly was a lot of hardships, but they come through. So, next slide. So during this time, as I mentioned, there is no huge Japanese presence on the island. There's just a little bit of an army presence on the island. Primarily, these Marines are getting hammered by Japanese aircraft coming over and bombing their positions, and Japanese ships that are coming down the Tokyo Express at night and bombarding their positions. And for the Marines, this is very frustrating. There's no real way they can fight back against aircraft and ships. So at one point, they captured a couple of these Japanese, and these Japanese laborers, and there's some confusion as to whether these were Japanese. We had mentioned a little bit about Okinawans. We had talked a little bit about Okinawans, or Koreans. But the Japanese, as some of you know, had like these slave labor battalions that they would send in to do some of this hard construction work. And they captured one of these guys. Unfortunately, the Marines, they looked down on them, so they called them maggots. They captured this one gentleman. I think they believe he was Japanese. And the intelligence they got from him, he told them that there was a group of those Japanese that were still on the island who would be willing to surrender. And this gentleman over here, Frank Gecki, he was a intelligence officer, and he was a huge giant in the Marine Corps at this time. He played football. He turned down a contract with the New York Giants. He was a graduate of, I think he played for Annapolis, and he had served in Bella Wood during World War I. So he had this heroic type of reputation in the Marine Corps. He was their intelligence officer, and he said, you know, he went to Vandegrift, and he said, I think we can avoid a lot of bloodshed. We can avoid a huge conflict and get this small contingent of Japanese to surrender if I just take a small patrol over there, because that's what this POW is telling me. That's what this Japanese POW is telling me. So on August 12th, Vandegrift gave him the okay, which later he said he regretted. But he set out with a 25-man patrol. They got dropped off on a little lighter, a tiny little landing craft, a couple of miles down past Lunga Point on that coast. So it would have been, you can see Lunga Point right there, right here. So they kind of traveled like this. And there had been this rumor that there was a white flag that had been tied up to a tree there where the Japanese were camped. And so the Japanese must be willing to surrender. Unfortunately, it's believed now that it was the Japanese national flag, and that the Hinumaru, the red disc in there, because it was folded, it couldn't be seen. The men got out, and these 25 men advance into the jungle, and Getki is killed almost instantly, shot by a Japanese sniper. The Japanese open up from the trees in the jungle on this Marine patrol. Most of the Marine patrol is slaughtered right there. I've never been able to confirm this, but one of the veterans I interviewed, I asked him, well, what happened to the Japanese prisoner? And he said, well, there was a first sergeant standing behind him, had him tied up on a piece of rope. And he said at that point, as soon as they got fired on, he took his .45 and just killed the prisoner right there, knowing that he had led him into an ambush. This gentleman right here, interestingly enough, Sergeant Stephen A. Custer. Yeah, name sound familiar? He was a direct descendant of George Armstrong Custer. So how's that for some irony right there? You know? And he was killed too. He was with that group that was killed. There were only 3 survivors. They were chased onto the beach, and the Japanese were just picking them off while they're trying to dig into the sand on the beach. And 2 of them were sent out by the captain who, fell on him for command. And they tried to swim back. They swam through the ocean to try and get back to the American lines. The last one to leave was Sergeant Frank Few. And if you've ever seen the movie or read the book Guadalcanal Diary by Richard Tregaskis, I think it is, that whole scene is shown in the movie too. I think the guy who played him was, who was the actor who played Zorba the Greek? Anthony Quinn. Yeah, I think Anthony Quinn played Frank Few. But he had to swim 4 miles. The Japanese are sitting there shooting into the ocean at him and everything. And he claims, and there's a little bit of controversy about this claim, that at one point he glanced over his shoulder while he was swimming away and escaping, and he saw the Japanese converge on the survivors, the wounded survivors on the beach, and start hacking them up with samurai swords. Okay, now, they also know that Frank Few tended to exaggerate a lot of things. So they aren't exactly 100% sure of that. Does it sound like something the Japanese would have done? Sure. It's entirely possible. So, next one. So think about this news when it gets back to the Marines. A big hero of theirs has been killed. This deceit of a prisoner taking him to this position and leading him willingly into an ambush, and getting these men killed when they thought they were willing to surrender. So we see these initial opinions start to form on both sides here that would carry over for the rest of the Pacific War. And again, that's another reason why this conflict is so important, because right here is where many of these opinions get established within the American culture and the Japanese culture of World War II. And what are those opinions? Well, we see, the Japanese are savages. They can't be trusted. This foreign culture that we don't understand is barbaric, and they're out to slaughter us. And let's face it, on the other side of that, the Americans were thinking to themselves, we're not going to take any prisoners either. This war is going to be a brutal, very savage war. We were discussing earlier the concept of haku ichiu, which some of you may know. The Japanese Empire had formed this indoctrination with their young people into a very militaristic society. And the idea here was it was almost like the Germans' concept of a master race. The Japanese were equally racist. We must understand that. The Pacific War, certainly. It was a racial war. It was very racist. The Americans were, in particular, very racist for the Japanese. They felt that they were not human beings. And in these battles, they just wholesale slaughtered them. But the Japanese felt the same way about Westerners too, as many of you know. They looked down on Westerners as being barbarians. They looked down on other Asian cultures. They were indoctrinated in this haku ichu, this master race mentality. And that would come out, as we know, in some of the barbaric treatment we saw with American POWs and with, this take no prisoners attitude. That the Americans could not be trusted, Japanese could not be trusted, they were sneaky and cruel. Atrocities were committed on both sides for certain. Here is a Japanese head that's been stuck on this tank, and a Marine is sitting there, kind of posing with it. We would see this as being a hallmark of the entire Pacific War. This kind of level of brutality you really didn't quite see in Europe going on at that time. Yeah. And this was reinforced when those when those Marines in Guadalcanal start to hear more and more of the reports that are coming out about how their brethren had been treated at Wake Island. Some of you know what happened there, and Guam, and the Philippines, of course, the Bataan Death March and all of this. Now, even the Melanesian natives that lived in Guadalcanal were abused by the Japanese. The Japanese would come into their villages, take everything from them. If they offered any resistance, or if they felt they were collaborating with the Americans, they would shoot them and kill them, torture them. This gentleman right here, Jacob Vuza, he became a huge hero in the Solomons. There's a huge statue in Guadalcanal to him. He worked with the Coast Watchers, Martin Clemens. He worked with the Americans, spying, and he was tortured by the Japanese. We'll talk a little more about his story in a minute here. Next slide. So now you figure to yourself, the Japanese aren't stupid. They're thinking, we've got to retake Guadalcanal. We've got to get some major forces over there as soon as possible. And they're going to pick their best guy for this and their best regiment. And the one that they're going to send in first, they've got a whole, list of troops they're going to send in divisions. But the one they're going to send in first is the 28th Infantry Division. And it is led by this gentleman you see here, Colonel Keanu Ichiki. Ichiki is almost like the George Patton of the Japanese army at this time. Of course, not as high a rank, but he is very aggressive, very confident, very impetuous, and he believes in the attack, not the defense. As a matter of fact, he was so aggressive that he started the Second Japanese-Chinese War. The second war they had with China in 1937 had an incident some of you may know about called the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And that was where the border, the river there, and the bridge that was over it between China and Japanese Manchuria, Manchukuo, he had his unit there and they heard the Chinese, they thought the Chinese were attacking. So what does Ichiki do? Ichiki takes his force over the bridge and attacks and slaughters a whole bunch of the Chinese, precipitating the next war. Okay, that's how aggressive he was, though. He was promoted in 1941 to command the 28th Infantry Regiment, which becomes known as the Ichiki Butai, the Ichiki Force. And they were originally slated to occupy Midway. So we forget that the Japanese were supposed to take Midway Island, and then they were going to set it up as a base. So they had to get troops to invade it, right? After the air battle and the sea battle and everything. But because they lost that battle, those troops and those transports, the Japanese were brought back. So now you think about Ichiki and his mentality. He's very upset that he did not get to play a part in this invasion of Midway. And probably many of his officers and men were too. So they wanted to prove themselves, right? They wanted to prove themselves. He believed in, as far as tactics, something called the Taigu Pantsu, the tiger pounce. In Japanese, this was the concept of you get your forces as soon as possible up against the enemy, and then you just, bam, assault them. You don't even worry about reinforcements. And you use a lot of psychological terror too. Noise, flares, hit them at night, machine guns, artillery bombardment, and you just go in screaming crazy like the bonsai charges we see in all the movies, okay? And that worked against the Chinese. At Marco Polo, it scared the hell out of the Chinese. And when they attacked, the Chinese morale just broke. Now, he has orders to land in Guadalcanal in August, and using this Tokyo Express, the Japanese don't even use transports because that's not going to get them quick enough. It's not going to get them there quick enough. So they use 6 destroyers, fast destroyers running at about 40 knots that night. And they load up these about 150 Japanese soldiers on each destroyer. And then they land them over in this part of eastern Guadalcanal over near Taivu Point, this area here. And the idea is that this force is going to move in towards Henderson Field and capture the airfield. Next slide. Okay, so what's going on in Guadalcanal at this time? Well, one of the good pieces of news for the Marines is that they finally get some air support. The Marines and the Sea Base had been hard at work expanding this Japanese airfield the Japanese had started, and they finish it. And they put the finishing touches on it using Japanese equipment and everything. And now they have a functioning airfield. And this multiplies the value of Guadalcanal, because now Guadalcanal is almost like a third aircraft carrier for the United States Navy, right? And one that can't be sunk. Yeah. So they have this airfield set up. The first aircraft arrived, a little escort carrier brought them over, and there was about 31 of these F-4F fighters, Marine Corps fighters, SPDs, the dive bombers. Later, Army Air Corps P-39s came in. And that was a tremendous asset now. They have this up and running. They have an airfield there. They can start to attack any sort of Japanese aircraft coming in. They can attack any of the Japanese ships in the channel. So this was a huge benefit. So it shows you how important this little struggle for this island was. Now, the Americans had won this race to control and make Guadalcanal a land carrier. Now, on August 19th, the Marines started to get some information that a new Japanese force had landed. They heard from some of the coast watchers, they heard from some of the Melanesians. And so Colonel Edwin Pollock, in charge of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Division Marines, was responsible for the perimeter running along the eastern side of Henderson Field. He had lined up his forces there along the bank of the Elu River, which, remember, I'm going to call it the Tenaroo. Okay? But the river there, which they were confused because of the map, that was where he emplaced his men. And they dug in fighting positions there. They carried in these machine guns, these anti-tank guns, mortar pits, because they knew that something was coming from the east. They just didn't know the size and scale of it. So what are you going to do? Well, as any good Marine is going to do, they're going to send out patrols. Okay, they don't want to be caught by surprise. And they send out a patrol led by a young captain by the name of Brush, Charles Brush. And there's about 60 men in this patrol. And as they're patrolling eastwards, they run into an advanced patrol of Ichiki's men. Ichiki sent out several of his men with some communications gear, some telephone wire and stuff like this, and they're moving through the jungle along the coast here. And this Marine patrol runs smack into them. And there's this firefight that develops. And there's a really interesting thing. I interviewed, again, a couple of the veterans were telling me, this Charles Brush was a smart character. At one point, his men were pinned down by the Japanese, and he moved over to try and outflank the Japanese. He got behind a huge coconut tree, and he said that he didn't know much Japanese, but one word he knew was baku, which means kind of like idiot or jerk in Japanese. And he started screaming from behind this tree, baku, baku, like that. And as soon as the Japanese focused on his position and tried to shoot him, his men were able to flank around the Japanese patrol and shoot him up and kill him. So they wipe out this Japanese patrol, and the first thing also, Brush, being very intelligent, he recognizes that these men have brand new uniforms on. This is not the group of Japanese that have been holding out in the island, okay? This is a new unit. There's also a lot of officers in this unit amongst the bodies that they find. So they know that there's a new movement that is, or a new unit that has moved in here, a Japanese, that is posing a huge threat. So he gets back, of course, to his side of the lines, and he informs Vandegrift and Pollock about this situation, that they are coming. You know, they're coming. Ichiki's men, as I mentioned, did not win any friends in these villages as they went through each one of these Melanesian villages because they were basically pretty rough with the Melanesian people. They displaced them from their homes. They would take their food and supplies and things like this. There was I believe he was a Jesuit Roman Catholic priest in one of the villages who fled before the Japanese were there, and he shows up in the Marine Corps lines and he tells them the Japanese are coming. And then Jacob Vuza, who had been good friends with the Americans again and the Coast Watchers, so good friends with the Americans, he loved the Marines so much, that they gave him this tiny little American flag. Unfortunately, he was caught by the Japanese with this American flag in his possession. And so they tortured him. They tied him to a tree, they bayoneted him several times. And this is how incredible this guy was. Vuza was able to chew through his rope. And even though he was bleeding from severe wounds, he managed to crawl back to the Marine positions just in time and warn them that the Japanese were coming. So you can see why that guy was a pretty big hero. Next one.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm kind of stumped as to how the Japanese were able to make landfall without some sort of protection by air patrol or
Yeah.
whatever, you know, it just seems like, I mean, they're going clear to the far eastern side of where the Americans are. And it just
Good
seems,
question.
You know,
Yeah. Well, remember that they had this Tokyo Express, and it was run at night. And that at this point, they pretty much owned the slot. They pretty much had command and control over the slot, especially at nighttime. So at night, they race in these destroyers real quick. And if they had used transports, the transports probably would have been there the next morning. And then some of these aircraft flying out of Henderson Field would have caught them and bombed them. So it was a pretty smart tactic on the part of the Japanese.
How did they get to shore?
They had their own sort of landing craft too. You know, on board the destroyers, they had little, you know, launches and stuff like that they used. So, yeah. And they did that. It probably took a while. And that was one of the reasons why Ichiki's unit shows up only piecemeal. So he doesn't have his full unit. And these 6 destroyers, he can only carry about 900 of his men out of a 3,000 man unit. So this is just kind of the advanced group. The rest of the men will be coming. Yeah, and the equipment, that was another good point. But the Japanese were very smart about this type of thing. If any of you know anything about the hardware that the Japanese army used at this time, a lot of it was made for being able to be taken apart very easily and for the individual Japanese soldier to be able to carry. So their heavy machine guns, the tripod would come off, one guy would carry that, one guy would carry the barrel, one guy would carry the action, one guy would carry the ammo. And they had these tiny little 75 millimeter howitzers. They'd take the wheels off them, they'd take the body, and somebody would carry that portion, a couple of the Japanese would carry that, somebody would carry the barrel, and then they'd reassemble this stuff. But correct, on board those destroyers, they didn't have a lot of room for heavy artillery, just lighter stuff.
Well, early on, just to point out, they attempted to bring in cargo ships with a lot of heavy equipment,
Yeah.
including like tanks.
They were sunk.
The Navy intercepted them off Cape Esperance, lost a bunch of our ships, but turned them all around, and the Cactus Navy then the next day sunk most of them.
Yeah.
So at that point, they gave up the idea of being able to bring in cargo ships, and instead went to those fast destroyers.
Yeah. And especially during the daytime. Yeah, absolutely. So now you see the situation here, and you can see Ichiki's unit moving like this, and he did stick primarily to the coast because as you get in here, it gets to be very thick jungle. And the Marine Corps perimeter, if you will, right along Alligator Creek there, the Elu River. Here's the Tenaroo, and you can see why there was some confusion on the map. The Elu is the next one over. Next one. So now, Ichiki chooses to advance and attack immediately. That's in his nature, right? He's impetuous. He thinks he's got 900 soldiers, brave Japanese soldiers who have been undefeated in China. He believes this tiger pounce will be enough to collapse the American perimeter, and then he'll just be able to storm in and retake Henderson Field. Badly misjudged many things here, as we know. Of course, the first one is the numbers he was up against. Ichiki felt there was only several thousand Marines there. And as we know, there was about 10,000 or so Marines. The other thing that he misjudged badly too, of course, was the type of weaponry that the Marine Corps had. And then, of course, the morale and the spirit of the Marines. The Marines had endured this much so far, they weren't about to give up, and just collapse like the Chinese had at Marco Polo. So confident that his unit outnumbered the Marines and could deal with this, he decides to attack as quickly as possible, even before the rest of his unit shows up. And perhaps there was also that aspect of feeling that he had been left out of the fight at Midway, and he wanted to make good on his reputation, right? Maybe rise up through the ranks or whatever you have there. And he also realized that if he did wait too long, that his own men could be in a similar predicament as like the Marines, where they're just bottled up into a small perimeter and they're being attacked by aircraft or whatever. So he felt, quick, that's what we need to do. The Americans now know of this Japanese advance, so the Americans are prepared for it. And they had ample time to add more defenses to this riverbank, for the most part. As you will see here, there was a couple of machine gun positions and artillery positions that had been well dug into the ground, and there were a couple others that they were still working on the night of the attack. But these weapons that they use, and this is what I wanted to point out, the old 1917 .30 caliber water-cooled Browning machine gun, which was considered quite antiquated at this time. It was a World War I machine gun. It was built for World War I style defensive warfare. You stick it in a trench, and as the enemy are coming at you, you're just gunning them down. But not an easy thing to move around, right? Heavy, huge. But it was going to pay dividends because in this battle in particular, the Marines are on the defense. And the other thing is it's water-cooled. And some of you have fired water-cooled weapons, you know that that gives you a specific advantage. The barrel's not going to overheat as quicker. And also in the tropical jungle, it's going to function very well. It's not going to jam. The other item, which was kind of a holdover from World War I, the 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. And this over in Europe would have been a joke. And it was for the most part. There was no way that these little 37 millimeter rounds could penetrate these giant German Panzer tanks, But it was going to come in handy because it's small enough that a group of Marines can physically move this thing into a new position. And it fired a particularly deadly round called a canister round, which was an anti-personnel round which made it like a giant shotgun, massive shotgun.
Like chain shot in the Civil War.
Yeah, like canister shot during the Civil War that they would blast out of those cannons, exactly. The M3 Stuart tank, of course, these were these little light Stuart tanks that later on they were finding would be useless in Europe, but they still had a role that they would play in the Pacific. That night, and it was a particularly horrific night from the accounts, and there are two scenes here from movies, and unfortunately I don't think we can get them to play, but I will recommend them for you. But that night, the Marines were very much on edge, as you can imagine. They knew that the attack was coming. They had heard rustling in the jungle on the opposite side of the bank. And then they see these flares go off and this horrific screaming from the Japanese. And the Japanese first wave of about 100 try this tiger pounce across the sandbar at the very end of where the river meets the ocean, the Ilu. And as they're charging across the sandbar, flares are going off. They're screaming banzai, totsukeki, all this. And they're also screaming, you die, Marine, tonight, you die, Marine, this kind of stuff. You can imagine what kind of effect that must have had psychologically. And that's all part of this tactic. And as they go tearing over this sandbar, the Marines had emplaced a simple single strand of wire. They had found cattle wire around Guadalcanal. And it wasn't really barbed wire, but it was about this high off the ground. They put two stakes out there in the sandbar and they ran this wire across it. And the Japanese tripped over it. They go tripping over it, and then they open up with their machine guns and these 37 millimeter cannons loaded with canister, and they just slaughter the Japanese as they're coming over wave after wave. Ichiki says, well, the sandbar is not going to work. So they lay down a field of fire, machine gun fire, mortar fire, the Japanese, and they send some more units through and some other banzai charges across other parts of the river. The river was not that deep. It was probably about waist deep, maybe about 20 yards wide. And so the Japanese go plunging into the river, you die Marine, you die Banzai. They're attacking these various positions. And because they had these machine gun positions and artillery positions lined up there, they are just raking down these Japanese as they're coming across. Multiple times they try this. Several Marine positions were overrun or almost overrun, but the Marines were able to regain those positions. The Marines held their ground, reinforcements moved in, and by dawn, there were literally heaps of Japanese bodies in and along the riverbanks and the sandbar and floating out in the ocean, where they tried to actually go out in the ocean too, and they were slaughtered out there. Next slide. So particularly gruesome pictures. Next slide. We'll come back to these accounts. I'm going to have you go to the next one, though. And these were the scenes they saw the next morning. This was a very famous photograph that was put in Life magazine in 1942. But this was the cleaned up version. Okay. Push the button again. You can see what it really looked like. More. And these photos are courtesy of a friend I have in Australia who visits Guadalcanal, and he does a lot of these kind of before and after photographs. He colorizes them, he finds the exact locations, that kind of stuff. His name is Peter Flahaven, great guy. But yeah, I mean, this was just wholesale slaughter out there. And then if I can get you to back up to that last one.
Yeah, back up. Were
Sure.
these photos taken by, obviously, U.S. Marines?
Marine Corps photographers, yeah.
And their color?
Well, no, these were colorized.
Okay.
So that process they do nowadays where they'll take black and white photos and color them. Yeah.
I'll go back.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yep. And then one more. Yeah. So now, again, as I mentioned, there are accounts, and I interviewed a lot of Marine veterans here. Gentlemen by the name of William Finnegan, John Joseph, who sadly are no longer with us, but they were on that perimeter that night. And there are so many accounts of this, as probably some of you know. Robert Leckie, who wrote A Helmet for My Pillow, and then the very famous Al Schmidt story where he had been blinded, Pride of the Marines, and he was one of these machine gunners. The story was that he had a crew. Again, these machine guns took a large crew. He had 3 men in his foxhole with him. There was, I think it was Lou Diamond, Corporal, Johnny Rivers, and him, Al Schmidt. He was feeding the machine gun. Rivers was firing it, and Corporal Diamond was directing the fire along a traverse as the Japanese were coming across the river. And Rivers was killed. He was shot in the head, and as he fell back into the foxhole, Schmidt took over the machine gun, and he started firing, and then Diamond was feeding it, and then Diamond was wounded in his shoulder and his arm, and he couldn't use his arms anymore. And then the Japanese snuck up so close that they were able to take one of these grenades, a Japanese hand grenade, and the way these worked is you pulled the pin, and they had this contact percussion here. They'd usually slam it against their helmet and then toss the grenade because it was activated at that point. It was fused. And the grenade landed in the pit and went off and blinded Schmidt. He got shrapnel in his eyes. And yet, there's still, Japanese are coming across this river in waves. So Diamond would tell him to fire the gun, even though he was blinded. And he'd say, 30 degrees to your left, 10 degrees to your right, this kind of thing. Because Diamond couldn't operate it because his hands had been, his arms were wounded, and Schmidt couldn't see. So, and they fought that night that way. Yeah. And it's, an incredible story. Some of you have probably seen the old movie, 1945, The Pride of the Marines. A good movie about what happened to him afterwards and his readjustment when he came back to society, blinded from the battle. And I wish we could see these links, but we tried them earlier. But if you see the HBO Pacific series, they cover the Battle of the Tenarue. And if you ever get a chance, you can find late night on TV, the old Pride of the Marines. They have that scene in there too. This was the canister I was talking about that was fired in these 37 millimeter rounds. And my friend Peter, he found one of the old stakes from that wire across the sandbar. Yeah, when he was out there and it was rusted. But it gets better because he found a little piece of the propellant charge from one of these 37 millimeters that had adhered itself after it was fired to that stake and it kind of rusted onto it. So there's definite proof that this was, and you see the movies and you think that the machine guns and the mortars and everything, But it was actually these 37 millimeter guns that really did most of the damage, as you can imagine. Horrendous damage. This is one of his now photographs, so this is present day, and the sandbar is still there in front of the igloo. I mean, it gets washed over from time to time by the tide, and he knows exactly where all these positions are. He's done a lot of studying that. Next. What are we doing on time? Yeah, and you can see what they did here. I mean, the holes that are in this Japanese soldier's head were probably caused by some of that shrapnel. His helmet. In the morning, the surviving members of this attack retreated back to the opposite side of the bank. There was a huge coconut plantation there, and they dug in positions in the coconut plantation. Pollock ordered a platoon of these Stuart tanks, these little tanks, to go over there and finish them off. And a group of P-39 aircraft also flew out of Henderson, now that it's daylight. And they did some strafing runs in the coconut plantation, but it wasn't very effective. So they send these 4 little tanks out there, and it was pretty horrific. I guess they said that some of the Japanese had climbed up into the trees, and these tanks would ram into the coconut trees, knock the Japanese out, and then they'd run over the Japanese. And some of the Japanese had also dug into these, parts of the sand underneath the trees, and they would just run them over. And I think it was Vandegrift himself said that he looked at the back of one of these M3 tanks, and he said the tracks looked like a meat grinder after this. So it was pretty god-awful, as you can imagine. They killed the last of the Japanese survivors in the area, and there are 2 accounts of what happened to Ichiki, and nobody's exactly sure. One is that he was killed leading one of these banzai charges, which I think is probably more realistic, knowing his nature. The other one that some of the Japanese survivors said that they heard happened was that he went back to Point Taivu, he burned the regimental colors, and then he committed harikiri, okay? Cutting open his stomach, which was traditional. I mean, a lot of Japanese military leaders still did that, especially they were met with failure. Now, the reason I don't quite believe that is, number one, this was only the first part of his battalion that had shown up. Sure, it got wiped out, but he was still waiting for almost 1,200 men to arrive. And he could have continued an attack with those 1,200, leading them. Also, burning the regimental colors. Why would you burn the regimental colors when not all the regiment is there, right? It's only part of the regiment. So I don't know. They're not really sure. They never found his body. But they do know that he was killed. Japanese losses, almost 800. There were about 30 survivors. There were a tiny, tiny few number of prisoners. Very few. And that was going to be, again, one of those wake-up calls for the Americans. Some of you know the story. American Marine corpsmen, Navy corpsmen, pardon me, would go out and try and treat some of the Japanese prisoners. And the Japanese would take out a grenade, and as soon as that corpsman got next to him, pull the pin and blow themselves up with the corpsman, commit suicide. So think about the message that sends. Why would you render aid to a Japanese soldier, wounded Japanese soldier? 44 Marines were killed in this, but very lopsided, as you can see. Next one.
One of the things,
Sure.
But it's not unusual to think they committed suicide
Yeah.
because it happened on Saipan and Tarawa.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, all that happened. So I'm wondering if that story came out after.
It could have. And the other aspect of this, too, is some people believe that Ichiki was killed initially in one of the very first attacks. Because you think about it, it would kind of explain why it seems like the rest of his regiment kind of fell apart, right? As far as their tactics and their combat effectiveness. They just retreated to that coconut grove and dug in. So there's some belief that maybe he was killed like in the first hour or so of the combat. Yeah. And yeah, there's one of the Stuart tanks in the coconut grove, and you can see again what was going on here with the bodies of the Japanese. Next one. So the aftermath here and why this is important. First, just the Battle of the Tenaru, why I focus on this in Guadalcanal. It proved to the Marines that the Japanese were not invincible, especially in night combat. The Marines were saying, hey, we held up to them. They're supposed to be these vaunted, feared night combat tacticians, and we were able to repel this massive attack, you know. They were able to secure the airfield. Okay, now the airfield is pretty much solidly in American control, although there would be battles for it later in Guadalcanal throughout November and December of 1942. This battle pretty much, they knew where they were going to set their perimeter. The Marines knew how to defend it. And more reinforcements then can arrive. And this is where this seesaw starts to tip in the slot, in the channel, where more American forces are able to get in, more transports, they're able to deliver more equipment, they're able to deliver more reinforcements. We know that several other Marine Corps units show up, and Army units start to show up too throughout November. After the Tenru, the Marines realized, though, that the Japanese would rather fight to the death than surrender. And although they kind of knew that beforehand, this was the actual evidence, right? And that word gets out. That word gets out throughout the Corps. The importance of Guadalcanal, which I think has kind of been stated already, but this was the first major meeting engagement. So we've taken the measure of the Japanese army now, and we know what they're going to be like, what they're strategically capable of. This was a hard-fought, clear-cut victory. It boosted the morale in post-Pearl Harbor USA, but it also showed what the future was going to be like in this war. The Allies had secured these sea lanes now, and Australia and New Zealand, the Great Britain of the Pacific, could help and aid in this conflict. It earned the U.S. Marines their reputation as a successful, self-sufficient force that was capable of handling much of the island invasion work in the Pacific theater, which we know they would. It was a major turning point in the war, halting the Japanese advance, started the U.S. offense that would conclude with the atomic bomb, Japan's capitulation 3 years later, and the expectation on both sides of no quarter-shaped attitudes, and meant that the Pacific War would be uncommonly brutal and savage, as we see evidence of it, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, places like that. It set this kind of standard for how this war was going to be fought. It's like, so, again, as I mentioned, there were other battles that took place here. Some of you know about Edson's Ridge, Bloody Ridge. Some of you know about the Galloping Horse, which was an army conflict. But the Tenru was really kind of the beginning of all of this. And that's why it was very crucial. After that, the Marines and the Army were going to know how to deal with these Japanese attacks. And for the Japanese on this island, this became horrible. Now that the Americans have won Guadalcanal, they are abandoned. And the Japanese forces, many of them starve to death on the island. Many of them die of disease, malaria, typhoid, things like this. And they come to know Guadalcanal as the island of death. That's what it's still called in their culture amongst many of their veterans. There is a poem here that was written by one of the Japanese survivors that kind of gives you an indication of how horrible this situation was. By December of 1942, the Japanese High Command realizes finally that Guadalcanal is lost. They have to get the emperor's approval. And Hirohito does grant them approval for evacuating Guadalcanal. And by late January, early February 1943, all the Japanese forces, survivors that survive, are basically off the island. Now that means the Solomons will still continue to become a battleground, but now that pendulum has swung. And the American forces are moving. And they're starting this island hopping. And they're going to be moving to New Georgia. They're going to be moving to New Guinea. They're going to be moving up into the Philippines, reconquest of the Philippines, and the island hopping, and all of this, and closing in on Japan to end the war. Here's one last one. And at this point, I am sorry that I ran a little long here, folks, and I'm sorry about some of the little technical difficulties we had. I do have some gear up here that you're welcome to come up and take a look at afterwards, but if there are any questions, just real quickly, that anybody might have.
What was the weather conditions like out there?
Yeah, you know, not as rainy as in some places, but there certainly was the moisture, the humidity, the rain, the massive tropical heat. Guadalcanal is not quite the same as some of those other Pacific islands like Tarawa. They were more kind of like coral atolls, you know. There was high canopy jungle as you got further into the island. And then as you start to get up into the highlands, it was more this kind of kuna grass, this sharp grass that they had. And you see some of these units, especially the Army units, when they had to start closing on the Japanese up in the highlands, had to fight through a lot of that. But yeah, heat, humidity. You can imagine the flora and fauna, right? Snakes, scorpions, all those wonderful things.
Dysentery, malaria,
Yeah.
everything you could imagine in a jungle.
Yeah, and because of the food situation too, and the constant diet early on of rice and things like that, there was a lot of dysentery going on initially with the Marines. They come to call it the Guadalcanal, because going to the latrine, that was what the guy looked like. So yeah. Another question back there?
Whereabouts did the Japanese evacuate from Finery in January?
My understanding is Cape Esperance, the very furthest section over here to the west. Yeah.
And during that period, just from, once the Marines were extracted, Army units were brought in.
Yep.
And then slowly they worked their way around. Well, by the time they finally got there were no Japanese left. In fact, they probably were gone weeks prior. Which says a lot by the way they were able to, again, get destroyers in here, at night and totally fool us in terms of what, was happening.
And submarines, too. The Japanese relied on submarines for supply. Interesting thing about the Japanese, they start off with a very effective submarine navy at the beginning of the war, but they never quite understood strategically how to use a submarine. They wanted to go after capital ships to sink battleships and aircraft carriers with it. And they had the excellent Long Lance torpedo, some of you know about. The Americans were the ones who really, and they don't get a lot of credit, but the submariners in World War II in the Pacific were a huge part of swinging the war because they sunk so much Japanese shipping out there. I think I've seen reports that said it was almost as much as the German U-boats sunk in the Atlantic as far as tonnage. So it was very effective in cutting Japan off from its resources. But the Japanese never quite figured that out with their submarine fleet. And they could have made a huge difference if they had used that primarily on American merchant shipping instead of American battleships and stuff.
Just to point out one additional question they said, what happened after that? We tend to think once the Guadalcanal was done, that was it. Solomon Islands fell off everyone's map for things. But essentially what happened is once Guadalcanal went, the next step was the Russell Islands.
Mm-hmm.
The next step from that is we went up to New Georgia because there were airfields there. Renova Island, Columbangora is where my father's destroyer was sunk in a naval battle. Then the Vela La Vela.
And Bougainville.
And then ultimately Bougainville.
Yeah.
And the war ended before we were finished fighting here. So ultimately, again, the whole thing was to get to Rabaul.
Weren't some of them strategically bypassed because MacArthur realized they're going to spend their blood and treasure defending islands that they can't defend because they can't resupply themselves?
Yeah.
Well, I think we could have skipped a lot more. Just
Yeah, probably. But I think you're right, the Rabaul wasn't it? Or was it Truk? Yeah.
Yeah, Truk and Rabaul were the key to the whole Japanese control of this area. While we're slow, this was Nimitz. The Navy's drive through here.
Right.
Up through
MacArthur.
Guinea was MacArthur. And the big drive for MacArthur, which also shaped here, is he wanted to promise to return to the Philippines. Well, you wouldn't be able to do that until you secured this area. So that's kind of the final story that happened.
Yeah, the sidebar to all this is that after the war, the 1st Marine Division Association was formed, and those people that had been on Guadalcanal, they set aside the last bottle, or the bottle for the last one to open.
Yeah.
They are going to open that at the Marine Corps birthday celebration at Camp Pendleton next month.
Tun Tavern, is that where it's going to be, on the spot of Tun Tavern? Is it going to be in Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, that spot where the Marine Corps went?
It's going to be
At Pendleton? Oh, okay, all right.
Hey, Don, what about in honor of some of the Marine personalities that
Uh-huh.
were on Guadalcanal, Chesty Puller?
Chesty Puller, yeah, of course he came in a little later, but very instrumental.
Medal of Honor winner,
John Basilone.
Okay, what I'd
Mitchell
probably
Page.
say is we can talk some more
Yeah, yeah.
on here, but
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Don,
Appreciate
I
it.
wanted to give you a little
Jazz coin.
the new style.
All right, thanks a lot. Yeah, thank you for coming, folks. And if you do want to stick around, you got questions, or if you want to